All right, so at the same time, this was an interesting story.
This is delicious.
Yeah, both of us were interested in this one. So obviously, Supreme Court struck down affirmative action. We've got new numbers. I'll show you that in a minute of minority enrollment, especially into elite law schools like Harvard Law. But some of these elite universities have been embroiled in a lawsuit alleging that they have basically ripped off their students to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, and that they have violated an agreement that they had with the federal government that allowed them to legally violate antitrust law. And without getting too deep in the weeds of this, effectively, they had to agree that their admissions would be 100% need blind, meaning that they would not factor in a student's wealth income, family wealth income at all in their admissions. And in exchange for that agreement, they would then not be subject to federal antitrust regulation. So this has been an ongoing lawsuit. As part of this discovery process and in one of the new filings, we are learning some very interesting details about how not need blind these universities were and how much they privileged the admissions of high net worth families, the students, coming from high net worth families who were well connected to, let's say, the president of the university or other influential people, or had given massive gifts to the school. And let me just go ahead and put this article up on the screen. And I want to read you some of this because the details here, listen, this is not a shock to any of us, but seeing the details of it really is something else. So the headline is, suit accuses Georgetown, Penn, and MIT of admissions based on wealth. The schools were accused of giving special treatment to wealthy students who might not otherwise have been admitted. So they say, for years, Georgetown University's longtime president flagged 80 students to be added to a special admissions list, but not, apparently, for their academic or athletic prowess, documents in a new lawsuit claim. Those on the president's list were virtually assured of admissions simply because of their family's wealth and donation potential, according to a motion filed on Monday in this long-running lawsuit. At MIT, 2 children recommended by a wealthy banker with ties to a university board member got special treatment, according to the documents. In a deposition, the school's director of admissions said the 2 children who appeared on a, quote, cases of interest list were among those who, quote, we would really have not otherwise admitted. At the University of Pennsylvania, some students designated BSI, or bona fide special interest, have a dramatically higher rate of admission than other applicants, according to expert testimony. Penn's former Associate Dean of Admissions, Sarah Harbison, testified last year in a deposition that a BSI tag meant the student's family was a big donor or had connections to the board. Those students, quote, were untouchable, and they would get in almost 100% of the time, according to this former Associate Dean of Admissions. She also said the admissions office was powerless to deny the student, even if the student was incredibly weak, even if the student had a major issue in the application. So this is the affirmative action that has undoubtedly continued, even in the wake of race-based affirmative action being overturned at the Supreme Court, where if you come from money, if your parents are, well connected to the board, well connected to the president, if they've made big donations to the school, or the school even thinks that they can make big donations in the future, you are put on one of these special lists in some instances, and you are on a glide path to get into these elite institutions that help to set you up for life, regardless of whether or not you actually merit being there. And seeing it put plain like this is really quite extraordinary.
Oh, it's amazing. I love it. It's just like the original affirmative action lawsuit. I'm so happy to actually, and by the way, I met plenty of these folks in school. I remember them well. Some of them, the daughters of kings and queens. We won't mention any exact countries, shall we? But well, let's just say their academic prowess was never particularly
impressive.
Noted or impressive when they did show up to class. What's funny is that when you pair it, you can see a complete freak out now of modern academia, because these people, they don't bring in $1 million, $2 million. We're talking hundreds of millions. Like, one of the things that you learn from the Varsity Blues case is that being worth a cool 20, 30, 50 million, they're like, that's a joke. That's nothing. You can't buy your way into Harvard with that. That's why they needed the varsity coach to get them in. The way you buy your way in, and the kids that they're talking about here, we're talking about 10, 50, 20, 50, $100 million donations to some of these universities. That's why they do it. Now, it's an existential threat to the universities, which is why they've been protecting this stuff for all time, because we're talking about millions per year in annum that many, alumni will donate just to increase their chance of admission for their kids by what, 5%, 6%, something like that. So you see that together combined with now the affirmative action hit that these places are taking, already of which the DEI freak out on this is huge. So let's put this up there on the screen. This is the new admissions data from Harvard Law, but it includes MIT, Pennsylvania, and a few others. And it says Black student enrollment at Harvard Law drops by more than half to the number not seen since the 1960s. Not just so happens when affirmative action was invented, by the way. Just 3.4% of the class. But what's astonishing is, lo and behold, the Asian number skyrockets, which is exactly what the people for the Students for Fair Admission lawsuits were able to prove at the time, which is this was a systematic racial discrimination campaign in the face of all of this talk about DEI and others. So, and of course, the fairest critique was, well, what about, legacy admissions? It's like, well, great, let's get rid of them both. So now if we have a 5-year time span to get rid of racial-based affirmative action and legacy admissions, we will have one of the most meritocratic higher education systems that probably in the history of the United States. Because even in the early 60s, you had all that crazy stuff with anti-Semitism and racism, et cetera. So this is a very, very positive outcome. Another reason why it matters is because as this starts to trickle down, and already we have race-based admissions that's been nuked on the admissions level for universities, is as we have this filter down to state and state colleges that are publicly funded, it becomes even more important. And you have it so that the actual public funded universities, the best single way to go from middle class to upper middle class or from lower class to middle class, and you remove some of these admissions practices, then we actually can really set things straight. Next, we have to do tuition, but we'll get there.
I mean, my feelings about this are a little more complicated than yours, because when I say the number of Black students in Harvard dropped to levels of the 60s, I'm not like, yay. But
well, then
my,
they shouldn't have been supposed to be there in the first place.
My opposition to affirmative action has been that, it's fundamentally a neoliberal policy that says, we're not going to change the distribution of wealth. And by the way, if you look within racial groups, you have a very similar level of mass inequality within those groups. And primarily affirmative action has benefited upper middle class or wealthier individuals within those minority groups. So we're not going to change the distribution of wealth. We're just going to diversify this rarefied few. And not deal with these larger structural issues, and make it so that, even if you don't go to Harvard and you don't go to the top school, even if you don't go to college at all, you're going to be able to have a stable middle class or working class life. You're going to be able to have a home. You're going to be able to have a car. You're going to be able to afford a family. You're going to have health insurance or health care, and not have to have health insurance, but actually just get the care that you need. And so rather than dealing with this as a sort of a Band-Aid on white liberals' concerns about the racial inequity that genuinely exists, that they see in the world. So, that's why I haven't been a supporter of affirmative action, but I think it does underscore, our education system starting at pre-K is wildly unequal, very much dependent, in spite of it being a public school system, very much dependent on what zip code you happen to be born into, what is the wealth of that zip code. It determines how much funding goes into that education system. We have some really great public schools. In fact, there's one, just a few miles down the road here in Alexandria that's one of the top high schools in the entire country, where you're sure to get a fantastic education. And you have some that are completely and utterly failing, not to mention the more that we have this mass class inequality, and I think we truly are in a second Gilded Age now, even if you look at, Elon Musk and him basically taking over the government, and the way that the rewards are just constantly rigged to flow to the top, you have to deal with that structure. in order to, you can't jerry rig it at the end and say, all right, well, we screwed you all the way up here, but we're going to give you a few token goodies here once you get to the top of the food chain and make us all feel better about the fact that you have more Black first-year law students at Harvard. The one other thing I wanted to note is, this didn't just look at Harvard Law, it did look at other law schools. It was not a universal trend across the board. There were a few schools where Black first-year law students actually did increase. I think Stanford maybe was one of those. But most of them saw somewhat of a decline. Harvard and UNC were two that saw the most severe decline because they were specifically named in the lawsuit.
Yes, that's right.
So I think they felt particularly like, they needed to really aggressively go in the opposite direction. So, the differences in the data here are also worth noting.
Right. So, I mean, look, I'm not saying yay. I'm saying yay to the idea that you have more merit-based admission. That's what I would say is good. And so if things drop dramatically, that tells you something about how things used to operate there. And it gives, look, there was also a lack of trust.
It was unfair to discriminate against Asian students in particular, is another piece of this.
They're literally penalized for for having higher test scores and for having higher GPAs. That's insane in the profession of law, especially in medicine or at MIT, any of these other places, which there was also significant problems that are there. The other thing that you see here is actually Black student and Hispanic enrollment went up at the state college level, which tells you what? That's a very good thing, isn't it? Because you can see that having access and having a merit-based admission system to more accessible, quote-unquote, colleges and others means that everybody can have a fair shot, which is allegedly, what the country was founded on and what we want. So it's very important for what you just said to understand about the wealth gap and return to. We've talked a lot about this a lot, but everyone talks about, if you look at the white-Black wealth gap, those statistics are bullshit and completely fake. The vast majority of the quote-unquote wealth gap between whites and Blacks is in the top 10% of whites and the top 10% of Blacks, because there are way more 100 billionaires, people like Elon and others, as opposed to, I don't even, Oprah and a few others. If you take the median, the wealth gap is not nearly as pronounced as what it is. People use the aggregate data. This is something, Matt Brunig has talked quite a bit about this. He has some decent charts from a few years ago that I remember cribbing a lot of these stats from. The point on this is that if you focus on median and middle class equality, then you actually come much better or much closer to restoring the quote unquote wealth gap that actually matters. And that's the one of between rich and between poor. But of course, that's very inconvenient. And it's much easier, as you said, is to diversify the top echelons. I mean, my favorite example is the NASDAQ, where you're not allowed to go public unless you have a person of color on your board. Nothing to do with your business practices or any of these others. You literally have to have a woman and a person of color. It's like, that's what we've decided to change at the highest echelons.
So the white families, on average, hold around 8 times more wealth than Black families. So if you are comparing on a racial basis, there is a significant difference. My point is that what we really need to do is there needs to be a better sharing of the pie. You should not have it be so concentrated at the top, where the only goal is to just diversify the highest heights and keep everybody scrapping amongst themselves for who can make it into the upper middle class, the wealthy, and the top. That is my point. Because I don't want to deny that continues to be discrimination, that historic discrimination, especially in housing, which is such a key building block of wealth, continues to haunt this country and continues to drive a significant wealth gap between Black and white. So it's not my goal to deny that. What I was pointing out is if you look within any particular racial group, you see a similar distribution of wealth in terms of the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Yes, that's true.
That's what I want to close. That's what I'm committed to. And there is no indication that affirmative action was a part of helping to close that wealth gap between the top 1%, the top 0.1%, and everyone else. And those are the policies that I'm interested in.
Absolutely, I don't disagree with that. I would just say the average. Remember, that average includes people like Elon. You have to look at income quintile of the median.
Okay, but
quintile.
Should they just be thrown out?
No, well, yes, actually, because it's ridiculous, to skew things things by including people who are worth hundreds of billions of dollars in the overall thing.
Well, but I mean, that's kind of a core part of the problem, though.
I agree.
You have people that have hundreds of billions of dollars.
But when you
that are
separate
part of the
out
system.
the top 10%, it's not even close to 8 times. It's complicated in terms of what it actually is. And I'm not going to deny that the gap isn't there, but it's not 8 times for what it is. I'm trying to find the Matt Brunig statistics that I was cribbing this from a few years ago. But the point stands that that's part of the reason why average is actually not a good statistic.
The median wealth for a white family was $285,000 in 2022. The median wealth for a black family was $45,000.
So that's what, 5 times, right?
It's
Not
a large
8.
gap.
Yeah, that's true. That's definitely true. A lot of that also comes back to housing, like you just said. But the part of the problem too is even in terms of housing is there is that big skew for working class, for within whites, in terms of generational access to housing.
Yeah.
Obviously, that was a big problem with redlining, et cetera. And that's one thing I will give them. It's true. In terms of denying wealth. There's also, though, there was a big problem after 2008. Matt Stoller has talked a lot about this in terms of where bailout disparity happened with a lot of people's access to housing because it was specifically Black and Hispanic households who lost access to a lot of those loans that were most susceptible to the subprime crisis, lost access to their houses, and then after the real estate explosion of 2010 forward, that increased the widening of the gap as well. So that gets to a lot of Barack Obama discourse, et cetera, which I know that he's been excellent on. So anyway, it's an interesting conversation in terms of how we actually move forward in the country. And it's one where a lot of the people who were posting about affirmative action always were very conveniently ignoring. I was always one of those who was like, yeah, let's ban it, get rid of it. You know, I think getting rid of legacy admissions is extraordinarily important to make sure that there's not a continued aristocracy in the country. Because everybody knows that if you just have somebody write your letter or whatever at one of these universities, you go from a 5% admissions rate to 50, and then if you donate some money, you go up to like 75.
Yeah.
Which is as sweet as it gets. It's a good
deal.
Seeing
the details here of like, oh, if you're on this list, you just get in. Period. Whether you deserve to be there or not.
Must be nice.
Let's really focus on ending that type of affirmative action.
Absolutely.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.